Hello, hello. Welcome back to the In Step with God podcast. I'm your host, JT Martin. Today, we're going to be hitting Fault Lines, Chapter 4, A New Religion. This is episode 6 of however many episodes we end up making it. So in this series, I am going through and I am trying to give a academic perspective on the structure of fault lines, how it's put together, as well as just some personal comments and feedback as I'm reading through the book myself. And so kind of to give a rough idea, we've talked about citations and maybe some spots where additional research is needed by anybody wanting to use the information in fault lines, where we need to be able to back up what we're saying a little bit more heavily than what Vodi does. Vodi has a master's degree in sociology and a doctoral degree in a theological discipline. So he has the ability to speak with more authority than most of us do in the nature of writing books and just making claims. That being said, there were a couple of places that he could have that citations were needed and maybe weren't there. So today we're going to be looking at chapter 4, A New Religion. This one was a hard one for me. I struggle with some of the stylistic choices that were made on this one. And we'll get into that as I kind of go through this section. But nobody should take this as me kind of like, throwing shade or dissing Vodi. I love Vodi. Vodi has been one of the most influential voices in my faith and in the foundation of how I've come to articulate my faith and how I've come to articulate apologetics. So I love Vodi dearly. I look up to him to a great degree, but this is part of the work that I'm going into, is addressing how conversations are happening, addressing how different things are influencing the way we have conversations. And so we'll go ahead and dive in. So the first thing that he does is he opens up this section with a recollection of something that had happened when he was an early believer. And so he kind of talks about these two men coming to his door, and long story short, it was his first interaction with the Jehovah's Witnesses. Fun bunch, I tell you. So that being said, we are going to jump into something that I think people don't. I think this is a misconception. I think this is a misconception that people have about Vodi's work. Vodi is not making the claim that CRT is the same kind of religion as some of the other things that are out there. I think one of the things that people have pushed back against the most, including myself, has been this idea of Vodi saying that it's a religion. That's not entirely accurate. And so I'm actually kind of berating myself a little bit. He calls it a cult, and he's structuring it as a cult, which is a very different thing than a religion proper. And so I wanted to clarify that. Now, then, there are still some stylistic things that I kind of mentioned that I'll get into a little bit, but I wanted to really kind of hone in on a couple of things. One of the things that he kind of goes through is, I'm going to kind of read these two paragraphs. Pretty sure I'm not breaking copyright law because I'm doing this for an educational thing. None of the videos have been taken down yet, so I think I'm okay. But anyway, so we're going to jump into page 67 Middle of the page, I'm going to read 2 paragraphs, and then I'm going to kind of break down a couple of things a little bit further. This new cult has created a new lexicon that has served as scaffolding to support what has become an entire body of divinity. In the same manner, this body of divinity comes complete with its own cosmology. Original sin, law, gospel, martyrs, priests, means of atonement, new birth, liturgy, canon, theologians, and catechism. We'll examine some of those topics in this chapter and a few later on. In case you're wondering about soteriology, there isn't one. Anti-racism offers no salvation, only perpetual penance in an effort to battle an incurable disease. And all of it begins with pouring new meaning into well-known words. This is a very, very strong claim. However, it is backed up rigorously. The amount of citations in this chapter of the book, as he gets into some of these things, are very well placed. I think that there might be a couple of spots that I noticed where it could have used some additional citations, but what I want to hone in on is I want to hone in on a couple of words to kind of help everyone understand the claim. So Vodi, what he's doing is he's saying that CRT as a cult has come up with its own cosmology. Cosmology is a word that means the study of the cosmos. It's this idea of cosmology. It is in effect a more academic way of describing worldview. Someone's worldview is their cosmology. Now, then there are more specific examples of cosmology that you may hear about later on in the podcast as I delve more into my research. But as far as this book stands, I'm fairly confident that cosmology is another word for worldview here. Now, what's important is that a cosmology and a worldview are slightly different. They're not exactly the same, but they're very interchangeable most of the time. But one of the most critical things here that I think is going to be really, really important to hone in on is the connection between original sin to racism and gospel. So means of atonement, gospel, and original sin are probably the 3 cornerstones of what I'm going to be focusing on as I really kind of dig into some of this stuff, because those are the 3 things that if we get wrong as Christians, we actually completely warp our understanding of the Bible. And so this is one of the most critical sections of fault lines. And while I love it, I will admittedly get into some places where I struggle with certain things. So as far as structure goes, on page 69, he starts the kind of the first chunk of the section, and it's titled A New Cosmology in the beginning. And then in italicized bolded text, on the first day, white people created whiteness. I am deeply uncomfortable with this. I, generally speaking, get very uncomfortable when people try to put alternative worldviews in representation with the Genesis narrative, first day, second day. I'm very uncomfortable with this. I get the point that he's trying to make, but I don't think this was the best way to do it. Now then, I understand kind of why it may have happened, why he may have chosen to do it this way stylistically, but I'm not comfortable with in terms of there was another way to do this that would have couched it in less overtly religious tones. Um, and I say that because even when we're dealing with cults, it's always better to stay out of overly religious language, because it gives it can be taken as giving it a step of legitimacy in my eyes. But that being said, this is a personal thing. I'm just very uncomfortable with the way this was put together. But I'm going to go ahead and read the bolded text, and we're going to kind of talk about some of the issues of this. Whiteness, a set of normative privileges granted to white-skinned individuals and groups, which is invisible to those privileged by it. This is so this is where we get into maybe a little bit of difficulty in terms of how something is cited. It's well cited, like, don't get me wrong. It was a good citation, and he has a chunk before it that is, I guess I should read that too. Although many white people feel that being white has no meaning, this feeling is unique to white people and is a key part of what it means to be white. To see one's race as having no meaning is a privilege only. Whites are afforded. To claim to be just human and thus outside of race is one of the most powerful and pervasive manifestations of whiteness. So this is a quote from D'Angelo and Sensoy, Is Everyone Really Equal? And then we have a quote from the Anti-Racist Glossary in an entry from Neil Shenvi, which is what I read first. Whiteness, a set of normative privileges granted to white-skinned individuals and groups, which is invisible to those privileged by it. I think that this captures the heart of the stuff from D'Angelo and Sensoy. Like, I get why he wants something a little bit more punchy and boxed in, especially in a popular book. But I would have loved to see an academic analysis of that quote from D'Angelo and Sensoy. I think this is yeah. So that's something that I think is, yeah. So this is where the uncomfortable stuff really starts for me, is that he makes the claim that this invisible privilege is equivalent to the importance of Genesis 1:1 in Christianity. I'll admit, I would want that to be a little bit more walked to. I don't think he's wrong. Hear me on this. I don't think he's wrong about this. I think that there was just a better way that it could have been said. 1 second. Okay. So I feel like this could have been walked to a little bit more, and maybe kind of done some breakdowns. I don't know. This just doesn't, I wrestle with the placement of that. And so this is something that, so now then I'm going to read a couple other sections of this. We're going to be reading a lot more today than usual, because it's so detailed. So he goes on to then say this, basically that similar to how Christians can't conceive of a worldview apart from God being real, Vody is making the argument that the cult of anti-racism equally cannot see the world without whiteness, or without the specifically, and I'm quoting here, the creation of whiteness with the express purpose of establishing white people as the dominant hegemonic oppressors and all non-white people as the objects of that oppression. So what he's saying is that the anti-racist perspective cannot understand a world where white is not equivalent to oppressor and non-white is not equivalent to oppressed. So one thing that I want to really get in here, this is massively problematic for any Christian worldview. The minute that a Christian worldview tries to ascribe a secondary meaning to a specific group of humans that is not already mandated by God, we are playing God. I'm just very uncomfortable with the notion that, so let me put it this way. I am white. If Vody is right, what the anti-racist cult is saying is that my entire existence is solely perpetuated by and is perpetuating a system where I am an active oppressor by merely existing. That makes me deeply uncomfortable because, and this gets into some of the other things that he talks about, because what it means is that by my mere existence, not only am I sinful, but I am by my nature inherently incapable of not breaking God's command, which this is, I think, where he gets, I think this is part of the line of logic that got Vody to the claim that this aspect of CRT is equivalent to total depravity, because there is a sense in which some of what the anti-racist perspective says that logically concludes that white people are incapable of not participating in oppression of others. That's what it's saying. And so that's very scary for me. Yeah. So let us, this is where he quotes Robert DiAngelo, and this is something that I want everybody to understand critically. This is something that I have learned in my studies. This is, and it's even broader, but we'll get into it. This is a quote from Robert DiAngelo. "The terms I'm using are not theory-neutral descriptors, but theory-laden constructs inseparable from systems of injustice." In other words, DiAngelo admits that many Christians either refuse to admit or simply don't know that these terms carry the assumption of a worldview, particularly the worldview that lies at the foundation of CRT. Now, what are those terms? White and whiteness. In other words, whenever we are dealing with a worldview, and there are things coming out of that worldview, the terms, we have to pay critical and careful attention, because those terms could be constructed with a worldview that is being communicated in the mere way that you begin to use that word. Let me be crystal clear. The words we use and where we place them in our sentences and in our conversations and how we use them communicate aspects of how we see the world. And so from an anti-racist perspective, the way that the word white or whiteness is used communicates that anti-racist perspective. So let's continue on with something he says further down the page in 70. This is a quote from Encyclopedia Britannica's. I wish he had quoted. So this is where he needs another citation. He needs more citations in the part with D'Angelo. He quoted it, but he doesn't actually cite the article, which is problematic. Anyway, critical race theory, the view that the law and legal institutions are inherently racist and that race itself, instead of being biologically grounded and natural, is a socially constructed concept that is used by white people to further their economic and political interests at the expense of people of color. So critical race theory, in terms of a legal perspective, is that race exists solely for the oppression of the non-white. That's the core of CRT in legal studies, which I heavily disagree with. So Jarvis Williams, who I believe was I believe he was a central figure of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kentucky. Don't quote me on that. I believe we get more direct information on that later on in the book. But so here's something from Jarvis Williams. This is a quote: "Whiteness is not about your biology, it's about ideology." This is what people don't understand, is that the way that these words are being used by people is that they're communicating ideas that are more about ideology than they are about biology. So when you are telling somebody that something that whenever you're using white privilege, whiteness, you're not talking about biology. You're not. You are talking about the fact that they are committed and participating in an entire way of living that actively oppresses other people, despite the fact that they as individuals are not actively choosing to do so. This is massively problematic, because what that is similar to, and I'm gonna this is we're gonna go a little bit for the jugular here to really kind of crystallize what I'm saying. What anti-racism communicates in the words whiteness, white privilege, all those things, is what it communicates is it's similar to saying that simply by being alive, someone is the cause of the harm of another person. And you could take it one step further. What the anti-racist language of white privilege and whiteness communicates, and based on the citations that Bodhi's giving and my own research, what it communicates is, because you're alive, you are hurting somebody else. In other words, what's being communicated in the background, and this is what's so dangerous. This is what is so dangerous about the anti-racist perspective, is that unless you atone for your mere existing, it is better for the world if you are dead. That is what anti-racist language communicates in whiteness and white privilege is that the white person, the white human, unless they do some sort of constant working of doing the work of anti-racism, unless they're actively participating in the anti-racist perspective and work, it is better for them to be dead because they are actively, just by existing, harming other people. That is what this language communicates. Pretty scary, isn't it? One aspect of whiteness was, and I'm reading from page 71, one aspect of whiteness was a way for Europeans who were different to homogenize themselves from these enslaved Africans. Williams would go on to state, one reason we get slavery is because of the construct of whiteness. There are so many things that are just wrong with that historically. Yeah, Williams at this time was a New Testament studies professor at Southern Baptist Seminary. And so we continue. Vodi goes on to then quote, Ekamini Uan from the 2019 Sparrow Woman Conference. The reality is that whiteness is rooted in plunder and theft and enslavement of Africans and genocide of Native Americans. In other words, whiteness, white privilege is not about your biology. It is about the fact that you are, by mere existing, perpetuating and part of the same culture that committed atrocities by your mere existence. That isn't Christian. There is a difference. And this is, I think, where I disagree with Vodi. Because there is a difference between original sin, which in a Reformed context is the result of that is total depravity. There is a difference between that and this claim. Total depravity, for those who don't know, is the idea that humans will do the worst possible thing in the eyes of God that they can in a given situation. It's not that they're going to become huge, evil, moral monsters. It's that the option that is the furthest from godliness, the furthest from loving God, the furthest from piety is the natural first choice of the human apart from God. That's what total depravity means. Now then, it's combined with something called total inability, which is the idea that apart from God, humans can do nothing morally good. That is a different claim than what is happening here. What is happening here is the notion that for those who are white, who are biologically not of color, that's a better way of putting it. If you are biologically not of color, your mere existence perpetuates a culture that commits genocide. That is what this language is saying. And I'm not pulling my own stuff into this. I am dealing with that explicit quote. The reality is that whiteness is rooted in plunder, in theft, in enslavement of Africans, and genocide of Native Americans. What this is saying is that being biologically white means that your nature is ideologically to produce genocide. Think about what that claim is actually saying. That is a massive claim, and it makes everyone who is not of color the inherent enemy of all humans. It makes the white person the enemy of all humans, because it says that if you are white, your natural condition is to pursue genocide. That is a horrifying claim. Robin DiAngelo wrote the following. The quote that I just talked about a little bit ago from Uwan, that was given at the Dallas Evangelical Conference in 2019. That's not evangelical. That's not Christian. I'm sorry. Robin DiAngelo wrote the following: the idea of racial inferiority was created to justify unequal treatment. She said that to make the following point: belief in racial inferiority is not what triggered unequal treatment. Yeah, this is... And that was just day one. I'm so uncomfortable with it being day one. So we're not going I'm going to skip that part because I don't like it. It makes me too uncomfortable. So the second day is white privilege, a series of unearned advantages that accrue to white people by virtue of their whiteness. So again, think about the worldview behind this statement. What this is saying is that white privilege, a series of unearned advantages that accrue to people who are part of the ideology, who are naturally drawn towards genocide, right? By virtue of the fact that they are naturally drawn towards genocide. That's what's being said here. White privilege in critical race theory, by definition, in terms of the composite worldview, is a series of unearned advantages that accrue to people who are naturally drawn towards genocide because they're drawn towards genocide. So when you are saying that somebody has white privilege, you are saying that they are naturally inclined towards genocide and benefit because of it. That is what you are saying. That is terrifying. Think about that. Let me put this into context. Let's make an example out of this. What this definition of white privilege is in connection to the definitions that we were just talking about a little bit ago. White privilege is basically the claim and the belief that white people benefit from being a homogenous culture of Hitlers. That's what's being said. White privilege is the belief that because you are white, that because you are a person who is naturally inclined to genocide, because you are in effect a Hitler, by virtue of the fact that you are naturally drawn towards genocide. I'm sick. I was sick when I read this. I was sick to my stomach. Sick. Yeah. So the third day, white supremacy, any belief, behavior, or system that supports, promotes, or enhances white privilege. Again, definitions. So white supremacy in, I'm going to go on a soapbox. Okay. I am going to back off of this. Y'all need to read the book yourselves. I'm going to back off of unpacking this because I'm too frustrated and I'm going to say something out of anger. So I'm going to back off and I'm going to go very much back towards the academic side. Okay. So 1, This is, so here is something. Here's another quote from D'Angelo. This is very well placed within this section. I really, now then, I will say this, apart from the style of how he structured this, I really love how he structured this section. This is very well put together. And so I'm going to read a couple quotes from the page that are not Vody, but he's quoting other people. When we use the term white supremacy, we are not referring to extreme hate groups or bad racists, they write. We use the term to capture the all-encompassing dimensions of white privilege, dominance, and assumed superiority in mainstream society. Again, this is what's cognitively dissonant. The very definition of white means people who are born with light skin like this are naturally drawn towards being genocidal maniacs. That's what the definition basically communicates. So to then say we are not referring to extreme hate groups is cognitively dissonant. It's not logical. It is illogical. It's not consistent. Either white people are by nature inclined towards theft, plunder, and genocide, which makes them an extreme hate group by existing, or something is wrong with this worldview. I am inclined to say that something is wrong with this worldview. Anyway, so then we have Matthew Hall, the provost of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, who gives this statement. Everything that you assumed or thought was normal in the world, or everything you thought was true about your tradition, your denomination, your own family, I'm going to pull the veil back, and what looked like this beautiful narrative of faithfulness and orthodoxy and truth and righteousness and justice. I'm going to peel that back, and I'm going to show you the rotting corpse of white supremacy that's underneath that the surface. So we have a provost of one of the mainstay evangelical seminaries effectively saying that piety is a cover over white supremacy. Vody is making his argument extremely clear, and he has constructed this passage extremely well. Now then, something that is different on this next section than the others is that he actually quotes something and cites it extremely articulately, more so than he usually does in this piece. This is the bolded text, but I'm going to read something just above it first. The white complicity claim maintains that all whites are complicit in systemic racial injustice. This sometimes takes the form of the mantra, all whites are racist. When white complicity takes the latter configuration, it implies not that all whites are racially prejudiced, but rather that all whites participate in, and often unwillingly, maintain the racist system of which they are part from and from which they benefit. So white complicity, white people through the practices of whiteness and by benefiting from white privilege contribute to the maintenance of a systemic racial injustice. Again, remember the definition of white here. White and whiteness are basically terms to describe people who are not of color that are by nature inclined towards genocide, that their entire ideology and worldview is inclined towards genocide. So people who are inclined through genocide, through the practices of reaching that end, and by benefiting from the things that are put in place to allow them to achieve that end of genocide, contribute to the maintenance of systemic racial injustice. Well, of course. If somebody is naturally predisposed to genocide and they have practices to achieve that end of being naturally disposed to genocide and fulfilling genocide, and they benefit from things that are in place to help them achieve that end of genocide, theft, and plunder, then of course they would contribute to maintaining those systems. Now then, here's the key. Here's the critical piece. Does white actually have that definition? Does being a white person actually mean that you are predisposed to theft, plunder, and genocide? If that is what white means, then this is logically consistent. But if that is not what white means, then this is a lie. If you do not believe that being white means you are naturally predisposed to theft, plunder, and genocide, then you can't be an anti-racist. And so we continue. This is so well put together. I mean, I get frustrated talking about this, but it is so well put together. The beginning of this book was probably where some of the not best stuff was. The more I read, the more I am convinced of a lot of issues that Vody is dealing with. So this is where things get fun. So Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners magazine, made the following statements. Without confession to the sin of white racism, white supremacy, and white privilege, people who call themselves white Christians will never be free from the bondage of a lie, a myth, an ideology, and an idol. This sentiment is an affront to the gospel. Yeah. Well, this sentiment piece is a quote from Vody. But again, getting back to the primary issue, this is so well put together. But think about it this way. What this is saying, what this quote says, is that if you are white, you are naturally predisposed to theft, plunder, and genocide. That is what your identity as being white is founded upon. It's what it's rooted in. The very nature of your identity means that you are predisposed to those things. And so you will never be free if you're a Christian and you're white, unless you confess to being someone who is naturally inclined to theft, plunder, and genocide, so that you may be the superior race. I'm sorry. I can't. That is the charge. The white Christian can never be free unless they are willing to admit that their natural identity as white means they are naturally predisposed to want to create superiority for themselves so that they can commit genocide. White equilibrium, the belief system that allows white people to remain comfortably ignorant. So all of the stuff that I have just been said is then wrapped up in a bundle of ignorance, which is part of the racism, mind you. In other words, the fact that white people, myself included, are ignorant of the fact that we are individuals who, by our very identity as white, are naturally predisposed to theft, plunder, and genocide. It's racist if we're ignorant of that fact about ourselves. This is stupid. The amount of stupidity in that notion. I'm sorry. I can't. Ugh. There's still so much to get through. Okay. White fragility, the inability and willingness of white people to talk about race due to the grip that whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, white complicity, and white equilibrium exert in them, knowingly or unknowingly. So white fragility, what it basically is it's a denial of guilt that is seen as a proof of guilt. And this is something that Vody does exceptionally well. He kind of takes all of this stuff and he basically he breaks it down into this simple logical format. You have white privilege and are complicit in white supremacy and racism. That's the claim. The response, that's not true. I insert rationale. The conclusion, that is just your white fragility fighting for equilibrium. In other words, if you're white, you are incapable of not being racist. Unless you accept it. Unless you accept that you're a racist. If you can't tell, I kind of get frustrated with this stuff. This is, ugh. So the core of a lot of what he's getting into just now, then yeah. So the last chunk of this section is digging into the definition of racism. And then D'Angelo kind of goes through and gives a different definition. So I'm just gonna read this question here, this section. If D'Angelo and Morrison are right, and one, racism is corporate as opposed to individual, racism is America's sin, and racism is connected only to whiteness, then it follows that as a black man, I am not only exempt from racism, but I am also not an American, at least not in any real sense. I'm an ontological other who's a victim of American sin while not participating in it. I mean, logically that holds up, but Vody's being more logical than the other people. So here's something to remember. Being white is not a biology. It's an ideology. So from the anti-racist perspective, you can be quote unquote white, somebody who's naturally predisposed to genocide, right? Without actually biologically being white. Remember, it's about ideology here, not biology. In other words, if your identity doesn't align with this world's view good person, you are white, which means that you're naturally disposed to genocide, plunder, and theft. The amount of us versus them and demonization is insane. Anyway. This is where the logic just completely crumbles, because effectively anti-racist language breaks down. Either race is a social construct, or you are born with a certain skin color and a certain race. You cannot have people born and ideologically. It doesn't work that way. Either white is you're born that way, or it's an ideology. You can't have both. Anyway, so this is, I really wish he'd cited this, because this is a critical claim. According to the critical social justice worldview, without social science, the Bible doesn't make sense. That's a massive claim. And there's just, Jarvis Williams, that guy from Southern Baptist Seminary. Yeah, there's another quote from him in 2018. Race and racial reconciliation are soteriological issues. So let me put it to you this way. You know what? No, I've said everything that I can say about that. This section is extremely well cited. I mean, he has one citation on page 86 where he does a massive breakdown of stuff. Fantastic. He goes into the works-based theology of reconciliation. I mean, it's just, this chapter is so well put together. I know I am massively over time, but this stuff really bothers me. I'm frightened, to be frank. I am frightened. So anyway, this has been the In Step with God podcast. This is Fault Lines Part 6. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. We'll see you next time.